Good morning, class. Today's on science lesson, we shall learn about asexual and sexual reproduction. Of course, today we shall start with sexual reproduction first in plants, then we shall go also in asexual reproduction in plants. We know in our earlier lesson, we had slightly seen comparative anatomy. We were trying to compare structures of different animals. We were trying to see their similarities. And in the past lesson, we said when we are comparing the structures of various various structures of animals, we say we compare the functions of the systems and organs of different animals. And we said when we are comparing structures, we do this when we are doing that, it is what we call comparative anatomy. And in comparative anatomy, it gives the scientist evidence of evolutions because many scientists believe that organisms which have similar characteristics have a common ancestor. We also said in comparative anatomy, it is used by the scientist to classify organisms based on similar anatomical structures. And as we had said that we shall see keenly the structures, maybe if we talk of the skeletal structures of a horse, of an ox, when we are trying to check the front limbs. The front limbs you find they are similar, although their functions might differ here and there. Even when we talk of alimentary canal, we say when you check the alimentary canal of a chicken, a pig, and a cow, there are some structures that are similar in them. That one, we shall discuss that details with an aid of a diagram. However, today, we are embarking on a sexual and sexual reproduction in plants. And the basic facts about sexual reproduction in plants, the basic facts are: one, what is reproduction? Reproduction means making again, producing new generation of plants and animal. So we are asking ourselves, what is reproduction? So we have said the term reproduction, we can simply define it, give it a meaning. We have said reproduction means making again. Now, when we say reproduction means making again or reproducing new generation, it means making again or reproducing new generation of plants and animals. So the method that plants and animals use to give forth to other new springs, if they are giving forth to other offsprings, then we say they are reproducing. So we are saying these are simple facts. Then in sexual and asexual reproduction, we say we have sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. We can start with what is asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction is the production of offspring from a single parent organisms without the fusion of gametes. We can define asexual reproduction as the production of offspring. We are saying asexual reproduction is the productions of offspring from a single parent, from a single parent organism. From a single parent organism, yes, from a single parent organism without the fusion of gametes. Without the fusion of gametes. So if we have a reproduction, we are trying to make again the similar organisms, when we get another offspring that is similar to the parent organisms, and yet it is just a single organism that is giving rise to another new offspring, then such a kind of reproduction of multiplication is what we are terming asexual reproduction. Is the production of an offspring from a single parent organism without the fusion of gametes. We define that one as sexual reproduction. Then what about sexual reproduction now? We are trying to get simple facts. We are trying to get the basic facts that deals with asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. Once we have enumerated our basic facts that deals with sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction, then we shall go ahead and first concentrate on sexual reproduction in plants. When we are through with sexual reproduction in plants, then we shall go to asexual reproduction also in plants. So we are saying, what is sexual reproduction? We are saying sexual reproduction, this one, it involves the union of gametes, that is sex cells. So we are saying it involves the fusion of gametes, and that is gametes, that is sex cells, from male and female parent. So we are saying it involves, sexual reproduction involves the fusion of gametes, that is sex cells, from male and female parents, from two parents, from male and female parents. Each gamete carrying half of the genetic information. Each gamete carrying a half of genetic information. So each sex gamete will have to carry a half of each genetic information that it will be donating to the offspring, so that in the end we have an offspring that does not look completely as the male parent or the female parent. So we are saying from the male and female parent, and each gamete carrying a half of genetic information from each parent. Yeah, carrying a half of genetic information from each parent. So the conclusion here is the offsprings are different to either parent. The offsprings So what we are saying, because the offspring takes a half of genetic information from the female parent and another half of the genetic information from the male parent. So the offspring does not look similar. They are similar but not the same as the two parents that has given forth to the offspring. So we are saying yes. So they will look similar but not the same. The offspring will just look similar as the parent but not same as the parent offspring, because the offspring has taken a half of genetic information from both parents, that is the female parent and the male parent. Another basic facts about sexual reproduction. We want to know another basic fact about sexual reproduction is it is important because of the variation of offsprings compared to the parent. It is important because of the variation. And variation has got its own benefits. So we are saying sexual reproduction is important because of the variation in offspring compared to the parent. And we shall see these variations, the importance of this, the benefits of this variation, when we shall be compared sexual reproduction and sexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. What are some of the benefits of sexual reproduction over the asexual reproduction as far as this information on genetics is concerned? Then another important fact about sexual and asexual reproduction is the sperm cell produced in the testes of an animal male gamete we are saying a sperm cell produced from an animal of a male gamete, that is a sex cell, that is a sex cell is produced. In plants, the male gamete sex cell is in pollen. So we are saying a sperm cell is produced from a testes. We have a testes of an animal. An animal. That is sex cell. But in plants, the sex male cell is produced is in pollen, the pollen grains. That's another basic fact. We are saying sex cell, male gamete, it is produced, called the sperm, is produced in a testis, that is in a male parent, that's in an animal. But we are saying in plants, the same sex male cell, it is produced in the pollen. That's another fact. And then we need to know about this, the zygote, a zygote. Zygote. We have important information on a zygote. What is it? We are saying zygote is formed when a male and female gametes combine. It is formed when a male and a female gamete combine So we are saying a zygote is formed when a male and a female gamete combines in a process called fertilization. So when a male and female gamete combines together, they combine in a process called fertilization. They form what we call a zygote. We shall later on study this fertilization because we have different ways, different types of fertilization as we shall study them. Then we are saying another basic fact on sexual and asexual reproduction is after fertilization, a plant embryo develops into a seed. It develops into a seed which the ovary swells and becomes a fruit. We are saying after fertilization, the plant embryo develops into a seed while the ovary swells to become a fruit. We have just given basic information on sexual and asexual reproduction, but we said today we shall deal closely with sexual reproduction in plants. So we are saying our topic of the day will be sexual reproduction in plants. When we are through with sexual reproduction in plants, we shall also see asexual reproduction in plants. So when we talk of sexual reproduction in plants, we are saying, well, we are dealing with the plants, we are dealing with flowering plants. So the flower is where sexual reproduction occurs in flowering plant. The flower is where the sexual reproduction occurs in flowering plant. The flower is where sexual reproduction occurs in flowering plant. We are saying other plants that do not flower, they have their other way of reproducing or giving rise to new offspring. But flowering plant, well, when the sexual reproduction takes place, it takes place in a flowering plant. And we shall have a slight diagram of a flower and show exactly what takes place. So we are saying many plants have both the male, these flowering plants, most of these flowering plants, they have both the male part and the female organs. The male part is called the stamen. The male part is called the stamen, and this male part called the stamen, it is the one that produces the pollen grains. When the pollen grains are produced from the stamen, these pollen grains are the one when they fall on the stigma. They fall on the stigma, we shall say, when they fall on the stigma, somehow there's a process whereby that pollen grain will germinate. It will germinate a tube that will go straight to the ovary. And in the ovary, it will meet with the ovules, and it will be able to fertilize. Fertilization will be able to take place in the ovary. We shall explain that one clearly with the use of a symbol diagram. But what we are saying here is the male part stamen produces pollen that combines with ovum, producing ovary to form a seed. Yes, yes. The male part stamen produces pollen that combines with ovum. So stamen combines with ovum. It combines with the ovum, producing ovary to form a seed. Producing ovary to form a seed. Now, when we are talking of stamens, the stamen consists of two parts. And these parts, we want to name them. The first part is called the anther. It consists of two parts. The first part is called the anther, which actually makes the pollen. The anther, which actually makes the pollen. And when we talk of the pollen, that is the pollen grains. The pollen grains are the male part that will be able to carry out the fertilization process when it combines with the ovum. Then the second part, the other part is called the filament. The other part is called the filament or the stalk. So there is the anther and the filament. When we talk the anther and the filament, they make up the stamen. The stamen consists of the filament and the anther. And we have said the anther is the one responsible for production of the pollen grains. Now we have the other part called the carpel. We have the carpel, and we are saying the carpel consists of the stigma, the style, and ovaries. This is the female part. This is the female part of the flowering plant. So we are saying the carpel consists of the stigma, the style, and the ovary. So we are saying, when you talk of the carpel, that's the male part of the female flower. It consists of the stigma, style, and the ovaries. The stigma, style, and the ovaries, all these three, they make up the carpel. And we're saying the stigma is at the top of the style. We are saying the stigma is at the top of the style. We know we have tried to name some parts of the carpel. We have tried to name what makes up the stamen and so forth. But maybe we might not in a position to understand this. But when I'm through, I will have a simple diagram explaining what I've been naming: the stamen, the style, the ovary, the ovules, all of them with a simple diagram. We shall be able to see this female part of the flower and the male part of the flower. So we are saying at the top of the style, and this stigma at the style, it is feathery, sticky, and any pollen reaching it sticks to it. So we are being told that the stigma is, it is feathery and sticky. And sticky, it is feathery and sticky, and any pollen reaching it sticks. Any pollen falling on the stigma, it sticks because this style and the stigma, it is feathery and sticky. So any pollen grains falling on it will obviously stick. So we are saying some flowers produce nectar, and some flowers which have nectar towards the sepals or the petals, or just on the ovaries, close to the ovaries there. So we're saying some flowers produce nectar. They do that because they attract insects. They attract birds, which bring pollen grains. So you'll find that birds or insects which move from one part of flower to another, they will move while they are carrying pollen grains within their feet or their wings, and they will assist in in the process called pollination, and that pollination will cause what you call fertilization in the end. So we are saying the petals are small colored patterns that attract insects, birds, and so forth, small animals to them. So these animals will try, when they are looking for the nectar, then in the process of looking for the nectar, they will carry the pollen grains that are on their feet, that are on their wings, then they will be transferred to these ovaries and so forth. So we can say flowers have some pollinating agents. Some of the pollinating agents of flowering plants are the bird, we have called the birds of the air, the wind, and the insects. And we are saying some flowers also produce a smell, a scent that is pleasing, and this scent will attract insects, plants, birds, and animals to these plants. We can have a simple diagram trying to illustrate these happenings. We are saying the transfer of pollen from the anther to stigma is what we call pollination. The transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma is what we call pollination. And they can occur pollination within that particular plant. That is, if it's a single flower that has got different, it has got different anthers. It has styles, different anthers. If these anthers will be able to pollinate that stigma, then we say that one, it's the pollination that has taken place within the very, very flower. But if pollen grains will jump from that particular flowering plant to another different flower plant of the same family, then we shall talk of cross-pollination. Cross-pollination is whereby the pollen grains that are produced by anthers of one plant of same family, of same kind, are able to be transferred, maybe by insect or wind, or even if it is water, to another plant to carry out that process called pollination that will lead to fertilization. We shall also have a simple diagram illustrating illustrating self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination is of two kinds. We shall try to see the self-pollination of two kinds. Then we shall also see cross-pollination that happens, whereby plants of similar kind, of similar family, are able to pollinate by use of the agents that assist in the pollination process. So we can have parts, we can have simple parts of a flowering plant, and by having these simple parts of a flowering plant will be able to assist us when we are talking about the stigma, the style, the ovaries will be simple to us to understand this. When we are talking about the stamen, and we want to know the parts of the stamen, the anthers, the filament, and so forth, we shall be able to understand this. When we talk about the sepals and the petals, we shall see their functions and so forth. So we can have a slight simple diagram illustrating this. When we're talking about the parts of a flowering plant, that one, the first part that we are tried to draw is where we shall have our stigma. Our stigma, the style, and the ovaries, we shall be able to explain them. Then we can have a slide diagram of what happens on our stamen. We are trying to get the male part of a flower and also to illustrate the female part of a flower. And from here we can have if we have to give this one, we can start by giving what we are seeing in here in between. This is what we refer as the ovary, and the ovary is between there, and inside the ovary is where we have the ovules. Ovules are within the ovary, and the stigma that we are talking about, that is sticky, it's there. When we talk of the anthers that are responsible for the production of pollen grains, so when the anthers leave this particular part and they produce pollen grains, and these pollen grains are attracted to the stigma, is now we say, yes, that is pollination. And what will happen to these pollen grains when they fall here? They will germinate a tube, and that tube will come, and when they reach here, fertilization will take place when the pollen grains that were gotten from the anthers will meet with the ovules within the ovaries. Then fertilization will say has occurred. This one we call them the petals. It is an outer covering of the organs that are within the flowering plant. When we talk of the style, that is the style. It supports. Then when we talk about the filament, yes, that is the filament. And when we come to this, these are leaves, these are sepals. There are other names that we shall consider. So we, in a nutshell, and this one, we call it the stalk, flower stalk. So we have just given an example of how a flowering plant looks like. And from a flowering plant, we have drawn what a flower is. We have shown that the male part of a flowering plant, that you can have the same flower. A flowering plant has got the same part, the male part and the female part within its system. And we are saying, and the anthers and the filament, they both form what we call the male part, and we have the stigma and the style. They form what we call the female part. The stigma, the style, and the ovaries, they form what we call the female part of a flowering plant. And we have said pollen grains are produced by the anthers, and when they are produced by the anthers, they will be able to fall on the stigma. The stigma, when the stigma has it has a sticky, feathery and sticky, it will be able to trap that pollen grain that has fallen on it. That pollen grain will germinate a tube. That tube will go through the style and it will reach the ovary and the ovules. When it reaches the ovules, then fertilization, a process called fertilization, will take place, now resulting to seeds and fruits and so forth. But what we are saying, if now this is another anther, if seeds, pollen grains are coming from these anthers and they're doing what they are falling on the stigma and carrying out, and that process of pollination takes place within the same flower, we call that one, yes, it is pollination, and it is self-pollination. But if we have an instance that this flower is there and there's another flower within the same plant that is there, it is also self-pollination, whereby the pollen from here will move from this particular singular plant to another of the same plant, to the same flower of the same plant. Then if that one, we shall call it self-pollination still. But if the pollen grains from the stigma will leave this particular plant, maybe by wind or by insect, and go to a different plant altogether and fall on the flowers and fertilize, we shall call that one cross-pollination. They have to be of same family or same kind for cross-pollination to take place. We shall have a simple diagram to explain such an occurrence. But we want in a simple way to explain the functions and parts of this flowering plant. Maybe we shall start with the stigma. That stigma, it functions, it receives the pollen grain, so we have seen the diagram of a flowering plant, and we can remember some of the parts we had mentioned the stigma. We are asking ourselves what the functions is. What does it do? We are saying it receives pollen grain. So its function, it receives pollen grain. So we are saying it receives pollen grains. It receives pollen grains from the anther. And another function, it joins the stigma to the ovary. So we have seen that what the stigma does, we have said what the stigma does, it receives pollen grain from the anther. That's the first part. It receives the pollen grains from the anther. Then we can go to style, that's two. We had talked of the style, and we are saying the style, it joins the stigma to the ovary. Those who can remember, the stigma is up there, that is sticky. When it receives the pollen grain from the anther, then there's that connection, small like tube stalk that connects it to the ovary. So we are saying the style, it joins the stigma to the ovary, and what happens when the pollen grains falls on the stigma, those pollen grains are able to germinate a tube that goes through the style to the ovary so that fertilization can take place. So we are saying the style, it joins the stigma to the ovary, and then pollen tube grows through it. We have also the pollen tube. We are talking of the pollen tube that grows through it, then it supports the stigma. The stigma cannot exist on its own. Would it be able to exist in the air? No. It has to be joined to the ovary. So the style is there to join the stigma to the ovary. So these are the major functions that are played by this part of a female flower called the style. We can go to another part called the ovary. It is another part of a flowering plant. What is an ovary? We are saying an ovary contains the female reproductive cell called ovules. It contains a female reproductive cell. Cell called ovaries, called ovules. These ovules are very important. The female reproductive cells called ovules. The ovules are contained in the ovaries. So the ovary contains a female reproductive cell called ovules. These ovules are the ones that combine with the pollen grains that had fallen from the anthers. Then fertilization occurs. It becomes the fruit after fertilization. This ovary, it becomes a fruit after a process called fertilization. Therefore, we can go to a fifth part of a flowering plant. We can go to fourth part of a flowering plant, and these are ovules. Ovules that we have just mentioned up there. What are they? Ovules, these are female sex cells. These are female sex cells. These are female sex cells that combined with a male gamete to in a process called fertilization. Then they become seeds after fertilization. So these ovules become seeds after fertilization. We talked of ovaries. We had said the fruit after fertilization, the ovary becomes a fruit. But now this fruit, within this fruit, there are seeds. These seeds are the ones that we say the ovules will turn into seeds, while the ovary will turn into a fruit. We can go to a fifth part of a flowering plant, and the fifth part we call it anthers. Then we are asking ourselves, what are the anthers? Anthers, these are responsible for producing pollen grains. They are responsible for producing pollen grains, and in a very funny way, the way these anthers produce pollen grains, these pollen grains can differ with some characteristics, depending if the pollinating agent is wind or the pollinating agent is an insect or an animal. For instance, if it's wind, then you will find these anthers, they produce pollen grains that are light so that they can be carried easily by wind. But if they're produced and they're heavy, then strictly they will be carried by animal or an insect just within the same plant. We shall later on try to consider the characteristics of these pollen grains that are produced by anthers so that we see how they are well adapted for the process that is supposed to follow, whether to be carried out by the animal or the wind or the insect. We shall study that anthers later on. But what we are saying, anthers are responsible for producing pollen grains, and these pollen grains, when they fall on the stigma, they develop a tube that goes through the style down to the ovaries, where they meet with the ovules and fertilization takes place. We shall also look the sixth part of a flowering plant, and we call that sixth part the filament. We had already seen this filament when we were having a simple diagram of a flowering plant, and we were saying, what is filament? We say the filament is part of the male part of a flowering plant. What does it function? What is the major function of a filament? We are saying the filament, it is a long stalk which supports anthers. So we are saying a long stalk which supports the anthers is what we are calling the filament. And we are saying filament and the anther, these are part of the stamen. So it is a long stalk which supports the anthers. And we talked about, when we are talking about the stigma, we say the style is the stalk also that supports the stigma. So filament is a long stalk which supports the anthers. Then we can go to the seventh part of a flowering plant. The other part is the petals. What are the petals? They are also called corolla. They attract the insects. Depending on their color, they attract insects. They are also called corolla. They are also called corolla. They attract insects. These insects that are attracted by the petals, they are attracted, one, because of the petals. They might be bright, some insect like bright colors and so forth. Once they are attracted, then they will assist in the process called pollination. They can be able to carry the pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma while they are on their route to look for the nectar. Nectar is located towards the lower part of a flowering plant that is close to the ovaries and so forth. So when they are doing that process, they will be able to leave some of the pollen they've carried with them, and this pollen will be taken up by the stigma. Other parts are called the sepals. They are the eighth part of a flowering plant. We have the sepals, also they are called calyx. They are also called calyx. They are called calyx. This is the green color, they are of green color. They protect the flower at bud stage. When the flower is giving budding, it's giving more budding and so forth, the calyx is there to protect these buds from being harmed by animals and so forth. Then we can have the other ninth part of a flowering plant. We call it the pistil. The pistil. The pistil is the female part of a flower. The female part of a flower, we call it the pistil. The female part of a flower, we call it the pistil. It consists of the stigma, the ovary, ovules, and the style. The female part of the flower is the pistil. It consists of the stigma, the style, the ovaries, the ovules, and so forth. So the female part of the flower, we call it the pistil. And as well we know, the male part of a flower, we call it the stamen. So we are saying the male part of a flower, we call it the stamen. The female part of a flower, we call it the pistil. So which is the male part of the flower? And this consists of the anthers, filament, and the pollen grains. It consists of this stamen. It consists of the anthers, filament, and pollen grains. The anthers, the filament. We have the anthers, the filament, and pollen grains. So the stamen consists of the anthers, the filament, and the pollen grains, and it's what we're calling the male part of a female flower. We can go to the 11th part of a flowering plant, and we call the 11th part the nectary. And one information on the nectary, we are saying it's located at the base of the flower. It produces nectar. So we are saying the nectary, we have said it's located at the base of the flower and it produces nectar. Why nectar? Nectar is produced with an intention to attract insect. When the insect will be looking for this nectar, they will be able to carry out the process of pollination. Why? They will carry the pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma. When the stigma will be able to get the pollen grains that have been transferred from the anthers to it, and if they are transferred to the stigma, then they will go down and reach the ovules, and the process of fertilization will be able to happen. So we are saying nectar is important, depending whether that particular kind of a plant is attracting the insect to carry out pollination. Then we can have the 12th part, if you remember. In a simple diagram we had of a flower, we had the last part we called the flower stalk. What are the functions of a flower stalk? We said the flower stalk, its major functions, it joins the flower to the plant. Flower stalk, it joins the flower to the plant. We shall see exactly, we had demonstrated where the flower stalk in our symbol diagram. Now, because we have been mentioning this word pollination, let us define what pollination is, and also maybe look at the types of pollination. We are asking ourselves, what is pollination? What is the definition of pollination? Pollination can be defined as the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower. Pollination can be defined as the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower. So in our simple definition of what pollination is, we can say pollination is the transfer transfer of pollen grains is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flowering plant. Yes, to the stigma of a flower. So you can see that process. We know where the stamen is. That's the part of the male part of a flowering plant. Up there we have the anther. So the anthers which are responsible. Anthers are responsible for producing the pollen grains. When the pollen grains are transferred from the anthers to the stigma, then we call that process pollination. There are two types of pollination. We have two types of pollination. One is self-pollination. We are saying there are two types of pollination, and we are saying one is self-pollination. Then two is cross-pollination. So we are saying types of pollination. We are saying there are two types of pollination. One is self-pollination and two is cross-pollination. Let us talk more first on self-pollination. Now, on self-pollination, it is the transfer of pollen grains. It is the transfer of pollen grain from the anthers to the stigma of the same flower. We are saying self-pollination, it is the transfer of pollen grains It is the transfer of the pollen grains from the anther to the stigma, from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. So we are just saying the same flower, and the same flower has the male part and the female part. The male part, the stamen, and the female part, the pistil. So if the pollen grains from the anthers of just the same flower are transferred from the anther to the stigma of the same flower, then that process, because it is just the same flower, within the same flower, it's called self-pollination. We have said within the same flower, it's called the self-pollination. But also we have another situation that defined self-pollination. If there is a transfer of pollen grains from the stigma, from the anther to the stigma, within the same plant but different flower, then it will still be self-pollination. It is within the same plant but a different flower within the same plant. It becomes as it is the self-pollination. We are saying it is also the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers of one flower to the stigma of another flower of the same plant. Maybe we can write that situation so that we remember it. It is also the transfer, self-pollination, it is also the transfer It is also the transfer of pollen grains pollen grains from the anthers of one flower anthers of one flower, yes, from the anthers of one flower to the stigma of another flower of the same plant, So we are saying self-pollination can occur within the same flower itself. Also, it can occur within the same plant, but of different flowers. There are flowers of the same plant. If one flower can be able to carry out fertilization in a different plant, so that the pollen from this flower are transferred to the pollen of the pollen of this flower are transferred to the stigma of another flower of the same plant, then we call that one self-pollination. So self-pollination can be explained in two ways. One way we are saying self-pollination can be explained in two ways. We are saying one way is whereby the same flower, the pollen grains from the anthers of the same flower are able to move to the stigma of the same flower. Then we call that one self-pollination. But we have given a second scenario. We have said pollen grains of one flower are able to move to the stigma of a different flower within the same plant. A plant can have several flowers. If some of the flowers have pollen grains that are being carried to other flowers and to the stigma of other flowers within the same plant, we call that one self-pollination. So self-pollination can be explained in two ways. One, when the pollination takes place within the flower itself. Two, when pollination, the pollen grains from the anthers move from one flower to the other flower of the same plant, it is still self-pollination because all these flowers belong to the same plant. But if they happen to move, maybe being carried by wind or insect, not to the flowers of the same plant, to another plant altogether, then that process will no longer be self-pollination, but it will become now cross-pollination. Of course, to a different plant of another plant of the same family or the same whatever kingdom. So we are saying what we have tried to explain there is what we call self-pollination, where pollination takes place within the same flower, or maybe same flowers of the same plant. Just one plant has got many flowers, and if the pollen grain from anthers of any flower is able to move to another flower within the same plant, that is self-pollination. What about cross-pollination? What is cross-pollination? We are saying cross-pollination, this is the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers of one flower to the stigma of another flower on another plant, but of the same kind and same family. We shall try to explain what we are saying. What is cross-pollination? It is the transfer of the pollen grain from a flower, from the under of a flower in one plant to another plant of the same family, to the stigma of another plant of the same family. We can have this writing. This is the transfer of pollen grains This cross-pollination, this is the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers of one plant. From the anthers of one plant to the stigma. From the anthers of one plant, yes, from the anthers of one flower, from the anthers of one flower of a plant, yes, from the anthers of one flower, yes, from the anthers of one flower to the stigma. To the stigma, yes, to the stigma of another flower. To the stigma of another flower, to the stigma of another flower on another plant. Yes, on another plant, but of the same kind. Same kind or family. If we are talking about the family, we talk of the plant kingdom and so forth. So we are saying cross-pollination, this is the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers of one flower to the stigma of another flower on another plant, but of the same family. We call that one cross-pollination, where we say the pollen grains are being transferred maybe by an insect from one plant, and then they go and carry out pollination and fertilize the same plant, but the same family, the same kind of a tree, but a different plant, not the same plant. Then we call that one cross-pollination. Self-pollination is fertilization that carries on within the same plant, whether it's a different flower but within the same plant. But if it moves to a different plant of same kind of family, it is called cross-pollination. We shall come and continue. In our next lesson, we shall continue with the sexual reproduction. We shall deal with agents of pollination, and we shall be able to see the characteristics of this flowering plant, how they attract the agents of pollination. How are these plants well adapted to ensure that the agent of pollination is water, wind, or insect? That is the end of our lesson today. Thank you.